Notification showed up at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I was already in bed, half asleep, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I assumed it was a work email. I'm a structural engineer and late messages from the site crew aren't unusual. But it wasn't work, it was a bank alert. A transfer of $4,000 out of our joint savings account. I sat up. We hadn't talked about any transfer. We hadn't talked about much of anything lately, honestly. But a $4,000 withdrawal at midnight wasn't something I could scroll past and forget. I set the phone face down, stared at the ceiling for a minute, then picked it back up and looked again. Same numbers, same timestamp. My wife was asleep beside me, or looked like she was. Slow breathing. One arm tucked under her pillow the way she always slept. 22 years of marriage, and I still knew her sleeping position better than I knew my own. I didn't wake her. I put the phone down and told myself there was a reasonable explanation. There usually is. By morning, I almost believed it. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. My wife. I'll call her my wife throughout this because that's what she was for, most of the time I'm about to describe. Was not a bad person in the obvious ways. She didn't drink. She wasn't cruel. She remembered every birthday in both our families and still sent handwritten cards at Christmas. Our daughter was grown and living across the country by then, working in healthcare, and whenever she called home, she always asked to talk to her mother first. That used to make me proud. We've been married since I was 31. We built a house together. Literally, I drew the plans. We had a dog for 14 years named Chester, who died the spring before all of this started. And we both cried at the vet's office like we'd lost a child. That was the last time I saw my wife cry about anything real. Looking back, Chester dying might have been the last moment we were genuinely the same team. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The $4,000 had gone to an account I didn't recognize. When I pulled up the full transfer record that Wednesday morning over coffee, I found it wasn't the first one. There had been two others, $1,800 in September, $2,200 in October. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my coffee going cold when my wife came downstairs in her robe, asked what I wanted for breakfast, and poured herself a glass of juice like it was any other morning. Transfer came out last night, I said. She didn't flinch. Oh, I know. I meant to tell you. It's for the remodel estimate. I put her deposit down with that contractor Vonnie recommended. Vonnie was her college friend. We had talked, loosely, about eventually updating the kitchen. The explanation was just plausible enough. $4,000 for an estimate? It's a deposit, to hold the slot. You know how backed up good contractors are right now. I nodded. I closed the laptop. I ate breakfast. But that afternoon I called Vonnie, not to check up on my wife. I told myself I was just following up because I wanted the contractor's contact information. Vonnie was warm and chatty as always, and at no point mentioned any contractor, any recommendation, or any remodel. When I steered the conversation that direction, she went quiet for just a half-second too long before saying, "Oh, I'm not sure which one she means. I've mentioned a few people over the years." That half-second. That's the thing about knowing someone well. You notice the pauses. I didn't confront my wife that night, or the night after. I'm not a man who moves fast when I'm uncertain. In my work, you measure twice and cut once, and you never commit load-bearing decisions to a structure you haven't fully assessed. I applied the same principle here. I started paying attention differently, not obsessively. I wasn't going through her phone while she slept. But I noticed things I'd stopped noticing. She was on her phone more, but angled away. She'd started going to yoga 3 mornings a week, which was new. She met a friend from the neighborhood for lunch on Thursdays, and never mentioned the friend's name. When I asked once, she said, "Just Pamela from down the street," and moved on. We don't know anyone named Pamela on our street. I've lived here for 16 years. 4 weeks after the first bank alert, I found out the money wasn't going to a contractor. It was going to a man named, and I'll just call him what he was, my wife's affair partner. I found this out not by snooping, but because I happened to pick up her phone when it buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was outside. I thought it was her sister. The name on the screen was a first initial and a last name I didn't recognize, and the preview of the message read, "She suspects anything yet?" 3 words. I set the phone back down exactly as I'd found it. I went to the garage and stood there in the dark for a while. Not crying, not breaking anything. Just standing. Thinking about Chester, for some reason. About the way my wife had held that dog's head in her lap on the metal table and told him he was a good boy right to the end. I went back inside. I made dinner. I didn't say a word. Here's what I want you to understand about what came next. A lot of men in my position would have gone one of two ways. Either exploded immediately, or gone numb and done nothing. I've thought about why I did neither, and I think it comes down to this. I needed to know the whole shape of it before I responded to any part of it. A partial picture leads to partial decisions. Partial decisions leave gaps. Gaps are where people get hurt or where the truth gets buried. So I built the full picture. I hired a private investigator. Not some dramatic movie version, just a retired sheriff's deputy named, I'll call him the investigator, who worked out of a small office downtown and charged reasonable rates and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Within 2 weeks, he had confirmed what I already suspected and added something I had not expected at all. The affair itself was about 8 months old. The man involved was a divorced real estate developer who lived about 40 minutes away. He and my wife had met through a charity event the previous spring. She'd volunteered on the committee. I'd been out of town for work that weekend. The investigator showed me photographs. I looked at them once, put them in an envelope, and didn't look at them again. I didn't need to. I believed him. But it was the financial piece that changed everything. The transfers, 9 of them by that point, totaling just over $19,000, were not going to the affair partner directly. They were going to a shell account that had been set up 3 months into the affair, and here's where it stopped being a straightforward betrayal story and became something much more serious. The real estate developer was aware the money was being moved. The investigator had found email correspondence, obtained legally, through sources I won't detail, in which the two of them discussed using the funds as a down payment on a property that would be titled solely in my wife's name. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was quietly building an exit, funded with our joint savings, without telling me she was planning to leave. I sat with that for a long time. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't make you angry right away. It arrives more like the structural failure I sometimes see in buildings. Not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, invisible deterioration. The thing looks fine from the outside, then one day you run a stress test and the whole core is hollow. I called my attorney the next morning. I'll call him my attorney. I'd used him for business contracts over the years, but he referred me to a colleague who specialized in family law. And by that afternoon, I had a consultation scheduled for the following week. What I did not do was tell my wife any of this. I want to be honest about the moral complexity here, because I've thought about it a lot since. Some people, when they hear this story, think the measured approach is cold, calculated, maybe even manipulative. I understand that reaction, but I want you to consider the alternative. If I'd confronted my wife the night I saw that text message, there would have been denials, deleted records, moved money, and I would have been left trying to prove things that had already been cleaned up. The $19,000 might have simply disappeared into that property, and I'd have spent years in litigation trying to recover it. I chose patience over impulse, and I believe that was the right call. Not the emotionally satisfying call. The right one. For 6 more weeks, I lived normally. I went to work, I came home, I cooked dinner twice a week because I'd always been the better cook. I asked my wife about her day and listened to the answers. I did not sleep in a separate room. I did not pick fights. I was, by every external measure, the same man she'd been married to for 22 years. Inside, I was somewhere else entirely. My daughter called during this period. She called every Sunday, usually in the early afternoon. There was one call, about 3 weeks in, where she said, "Dad, you sound tired." I said I'd had a long week at the project site. She accepted that. She had no idea what was happening, and I was determined to keep it that way until I had everything in order. My daughter is perceptive and loyal, and she loves her mother. And I knew that when the truth came out, she would need to process it in her own time. The last thing I wanted was to pull her into the middle of it before I had solid ground to stand on. My attorney, my family law attorney, laid out the situation plainly during our second meeting. The money transfers were problematic for my wife in ways she probably hadn't thought through, because they came from a joint account and were directed into a solo account that had been established during the marriage without my knowledge. And because there was documented evidence suggesting the funds were intended for a property that would be separately titled, it was, at minimum, a strong argument for dissipation of marital assets. Depending on how aggressively we pursued it, she was looking at being held accountable for the full amount, plus potential penalties in the asset division. The real estate developer's involvement actually helped my case. His emails acknowledging the arrangement meant he could be deposed. His participation in receiving marital funds without my knowledge opened him up to civil liability as well. My attorney was careful not to overpromise. But he told me clearly, if this goes to court, you're in a strong position. I told him I didn't want to go to court if I could avoid it. I wanted a clean dissolution. Quick, fair, documented. He said he could work with that. I told my wife on a Saturday morning in March. We'd had a normal breakfast. She made eggs, I made coffee. Chester's old leash was still hanging by the back door. Neither of us had ever taken it down. She was standing at the sink rinsing her plate when I said, quietly, I know about the account. She went still. I know about the transfers. I know about the property. And I know about him. She didn't turn around for a long moment. When she finally did, her face was not what I expected. I think I expected fear, or anger, or immediate denial. What I got was something closer to exhaustion. She looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just felt it taken away. She said, How long have you known? I said, Long enough. She sat down at the table. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We sat across from each other in the kitchen I'd designed and she'd decorated, and we had the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Here's what she told me, and I'm including it because I think leaving it out would make this story incomplete. She told me she'd been unhappy for a long time. Not unhappy with me specifically, she said, but unhappy in a way she didn't know how to name or explain. And instead of talking to me, she'd found someone who made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. She said she knew the money was wrong. She said she didn't have a good reason for that part, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I slid a folder across the table. It contained copies of everything my attorney had prepared, the documentation of the transfers, the property records, the emails, and behind that, the initial divorce filing. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. I said, I don't want to fight. I want this to be finished without either of us destroying each other. The $19,000 goes back to the joint account before the filing is processed, and we split everything else cleanly. That's the offer. It won't get better than that. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Okay. It wasn't that simple, of course. There were lawyers and paperwork and a period of about 3 weeks where her attorney pushed back on some of the property valuations. The real estate developer, when notified by his own attorney that he could be named in civil proceedings, apparently had a very uncomfortable conversation and withdrew from the property agreement. I was told this secondhand and I didn't ask for details. The $19,000 was returned within the first 2 weeks. My attorney confirmed receipt. The divorce was finalized 5 months later. No court appearance. No public spectacle. We divided the house equity, the retirement accounts, and the smaller things with about as much grace as two people can manage when they're unwinding 22 years of shared life. My daughter found out about 2 weeks before the filing was public. I told her by phone, which I second-guessed. Maybe it should have been in person. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, Did you know for a long time before you did anything? I said yes. She said, That sounds like you. I'm still not entirely sure if that was a compliment. She flew home for a weekend in April. She and her mother had a long conversation that I wasn't part of and don't know the contents of. She and I went to the diner near the old neighborhood and split a piece of pie, and she told me she was proud of how I'd handled it. That meant more to me than I expected it to. I sold the house 8 months after the divorce. It was too big for one person, and the kitchen, which we'd never actually remodeled, felt wrong every morning. I moved into a smaller place closer to the city. New layout. I drew the plans for a few updates myself, which helped. The investigator sent me a card, a real paper card, that said he hoped things were going smoothly. I sent him a bottle of decent scotch. The leash I finally took down from the door. I put it in a box with Chester's collar and a few photos. Someday I'll know what to do with it. For now it sits on a shelf in my office. And sometimes I look at it and think about what it means to love something or someone for a long time without asking questions, just because they're yours and you're theirs. There are things I wish I'd done differently. Not in the legal process, I think I handled that well, but in the years before. The times I could see something shifting and told myself it was just the normal drift of a long marriage. The evenings I was tired from work and didn't ask the harder question. The way I let comfort become a substitute for attention. I don't say this to take responsibility for my wife's choices. Those were hers. But a marriage is a structure too, and structures need maintenance. I know that better than most people in my line of work. I should have applied what I knew. I'm 54 now. I have a job I'm good at and a daughter I'm proud of and a small house that I am slowly making into something that feels like mine. Most mornings, that's enough. What I kept through all of it was something I can't fully name. A kind of steadiness, maybe. A decision not to become someone I wouldn't recognize. A lot of people going through what I went through come out the other side angrier or smaller or hollowed out. I understand why. I'm not judging anyone who broke under it. But I made a choice every single day for those 6 weeks to stay exactly who I was. To do the right thing the slow way. To not let the worst thing that happened to me become the defining thing about me. I think Chester would have approved. He was always the most patient one in the house. I keep thinking about the moment I set that phone back down on the counter. 3 words on a screen. She suspects anything yet? And I just put it down. Walked to the garage. Stood in the dark. People always want to know, weren't you furious? And the honest answer is yes, eventually. But in that moment, what I felt most was a strange, exhausted clarity. Like something I'd been half sensing for months had finally stopped pretending to be something else. What I did with that clarity is the part I'm still proud of. I didn't make a single decision from anger. Not one. Every move I made in those 6 weeks, the investigator, the attorney, the patients at the breakfast table, came from a deliberate choice to think before I acted. That's harder than it sounds when the person sitting across from you at dinner is quietly funneling your shared savings into an exit plan. There were nights I wanted to say something. Plenty of them. I chose not to every single time because I knew that an impulsive confrontation would cost me more than the silence did. That's what I mean when I say intelligence isn't just about what you know. It's about when you move. My work taught me that. You don't stress test a structure mid-construction. You wait until you have the complete picture and then you make your call with full information. I applied that same discipline to the hardest situation of my life, and it's the reason I came out of it with my finances intact, my dignity intact, and a clean legal outcome. Impulse would have cost me all 3. But the part that mattered most, the part I think about when I'm honest with myself late at night, was the moral piece. I could have used what I knew to punish her. I had the tools, the investigator's documentation, the email records, the civil liability angle on the developer. I could have made things very difficult for both of them. And there were moments, I'll admit it, where that option had a certain appeal. I didn't take it, not because I'm a saint, because I knew that the version of me who went down that road wasn't a version I wanted to live with afterward. I wanted the truth documented and the money returned and the marriage ended with honesty on my side of the table. That was the line I drew, and I held it. The endurance part, just continuing to show up, day after day, through 6 weeks of knowing what I knew. That was its own kind of weight. Nobody sees that work. There's no moment where someone hands you credit for the quiet mornings you got through without breaking. But that steadiness, that refusal to collapse or retaliate or disappear into bitterness, I think that was actually the most important thing I did. It protected my daughter from chaos she didn't deserve. It kept the legal process clean, and it let me walk away from 22 years without becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. The leash is still on the shelf in my office. Some days I think about taking it down and I decide not to yet. Chester was the most patient creature I've ever known. He never asked for explanations, he just stayed. I'm trying to learn from that.